heavens had collapsed hours ago, unleashing a relentless, silver onslaught that dissolved the familiar suburban landscape into a blurred watercolor of charcoal grays and bruised indigo. It was a melancholic symphony, the kind of rhythmic drumming against the window pane that usually lulled me into a state of quiet, navel-gazing contemplation. This was supposed to be just another unremarkable Tuesday, an evening defined by the suffocating, predictable safety of my small kitchen. I had long ago found a strange, almost clinical comfort in the white noise of domesticity, the low, industrial hum of the refrigerator, the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the wall clock that measured out my life in tiny, plastic increments, and the soft, mounting hiss of the kettle as it crept toward its boiling point. I stood there, paralyzed by a peculiar sort of trance, watching the rising plumes of steam curl into the air like ghost limbs reaching for the ceiling. My mind drifted through the mundane fog of the week's responsibilities, seeking refuge in the predictable. Here, within these four walls, the air was still, and the boundaries of my existence were etched in stone, safe from the chaotic unpredictability of the world outside. I was the master of this small, sterile universe. Then, without the slightest warning, the atmospheric pressure in the room buckled. The shift was instantaneous, a sudden thinning of the air that made my lungs ache. I didn't hear the heavy thud of the front door against the frame, nor did I catch the familiar, metallic click of the deadbolt sliding home to seal out the storm. I didn't need to. Instead, I simply felt him. It was a sudden, visceral shift in the room's equilibrium, as if the stillness had been punctured by a new, irresistible gravitational force that demanded total acknowledgement. I turned my head just a fraction, my peripheral vision catching his silhouette framed within the narrow doorway. He looked utterly spent, a man hollowed out by the world beyond the glass. His shoulders, which usually carried a defiant, almost arrogant confidence, were slumped under the invisible weight of the day's burdens. He stood there for a long moment, a jagged shadow against the warm, amber glow of the hallway light, breathing heavily as if he had just finished a marathon through a graveyard. His dark hair was a matted, chaotic mess, plastered to his forehead by the downpour, and his white button-down was soaked through to the point of complete transparency. It clung to his skin in translucent patches, revealing the sharp, shivering lines of his frame and the frantic, rhythmic beat of his pulse at the base of his throat. The sharp, metallic scent of ozone and the earthy, primordial musk of damp pavement followed him inside, cutting through the warm, yeasty smell of the kitchen like a jagged blade through silk. "You're home late," I murmured. My voice felt thin and fragile, barely a notch above the persistent, predatory roar of the rain against the glass. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was anchored to the spot by the sheer, suffocating gravity of his presence, my feet suddenly heavy as lead. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't offer an apology. He simply stood there, a specter of the storm dripping onto the linoleum, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made the air in my lungs turn to ice. It was a look of profound, haunting recognition, as if he were seeing me for the first time after a decade lost at sea, or perhaps as if I were the only shore he had ever known. After a long, agonizing moment, a tired, lopsided smile ghosted across his lips, a reflex of sheer exhaustion, a silent admission that he had finally reached the only place he truly wanted to be. "Traffic was a total nightmare," he said, his voice a raspy, low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate directly in the marrow of my bones. "The world out there is falling apart." He began to move toward me then. His steps weren't rushed. They were measured, deliberate, and almost unnervingly cautious, as if he were navigating a minefield of his own making. It felt as though he were trying not to shatter the fragile, crystalline silence that had settled between us like a sheet of thin ice. As he closed the distance, the kitchen felt as though it were shrinking, the vast, safe space I had meticulously cultivated evaporating until the heat radiating from his chilled body began to override the cool, damp draft leaking from the window. "Are you making tea?" he asked. He leaned one hip against the counter, invading the sacred circle of my personal space with a casualness that felt like a deliberate provocation. He was so close now that I could see the individual droplets of rain trembling on his eyelashes, reflecting the light of the stove like tiny, shattered diamonds. I could see the way his skin was pebbled with goosebumps, the sheer physical reality of him overwhelming my senses. "Yeah," I replied. My fingers suddenly felt thick and uncoordinated as I reached for a second mug. The simple, mindless task of making a drink felt monumental, a feat of complex engineering that required all my focus just to keep my hands from shaking. "Do you want some? Please." A heavy, expectant silence followed, broken only by the deepening, aggressive rumble of the kettle as it neared its peak. I tried to maintain my focus on the ceramic cups, the tea bags, the mundane mechanics of the act, but I was acutely, painfully aware of his gaze. It wasn't a casual glance. It was a weighted, observant stare that tracked the micro-movements of my hands and the telltale tension in my shoulders. It made the small hairs on the back of my neck prickle with an electric, animal awareness. I reached for the upper cupboard to find the honey, my movements jerky and self-conscious. In that moment, I felt like a novice actor who had suddenly realized they were being watched by a master of the craft, someone who could see every flaw in the performance. Then he shifted his position. He didn't just step closer. He systematically dismantled the distance between us, moving to stand directly behind me. He wasn't touching me yet. Not quite. But the proximity was overwhelming, a physical weight that pressed against my back. I could feel the radiant, damp heat of his chest through the thin cotton of my shirt, and the air between us seemed to thicken, vibrating with a sudden, suffocating tension. I froze, my hand hovering uselessly near the tea, my heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. I couldn't tell if this was an accident, a mere byproduct of a cramped kitchen and a long day, or a deliberate, calculated crossing of the invisible lines we had spent months meticulously drawing around one another. His breath, warm and carrying the faint, bitter scent of black coffee and the biting chill of the night, brushed against the sensitive shell of my ear. "You're always so cold," he whispered, his voice a velvet friction against my skin. The vibration of those words traveled straight down my spine, more potent and intoxicating than any physical touch could have been. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening until it actually hurt. I couldn't find the courage or the breath to tell him the truth, that I wasn't cold anymore, that I was, in fact, burning from the inside out, fueled by the sheer, terrifying proximity of him. He reached up for the cupboard above my head, and as he leaned in, his body finally, irrevocably made contact with mine. It was a firm, searing pressure, the damp, heavy weight of his chest against my shoulder blades, the rough fabric of his soaked sleeve brushing my arm. It lasted only a heartbeat, a fleeting moment of intimacy that could have been excused as an accident. Yet it felt as if the entire world had jerked to a violent, tectonic halt. A jolt of pure, terrifying electricity surged through me. I heard him inhale sharply, a ragged, broken sound that betrayed the fact that he was just as undone by the contact as I was. But he didn't pull away. He didn't retreat into the safety of the accidental. Once he had what he needed, he stayed there, hovering over me, his presence enveloping me like a physical shroud, pinning me between the hard edge of the counter and his own staggering heat. "Should I have stepped back?" he murmured. His lips were so close to the crown of my head that I could feel the ghost of his breath against my hair, a warm caress in the cold room. The question was a trap, a final, desperate chance for me to reestablish the boundaries that were currently crumbling into dust beneath our feet. My chest ached with the sheer effort of breathing.
No, y whisperat.
The word escaped my lips before my pride or my common sense could intercept it. "It's fine." "Fine?" he repeated, a low, challenging thrum in his tone that bordered on a growl. He shifted his weight, his hand coming to rest on the granite counter directly next to mine. Our pinkies were barely an inch apart, yet the tiny gap felt like a live wire, humming with enough voltage to level the entire house. "It doesn't feel fine to me," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that made my knees weak. "It feels like I've been trying to stay on my side of the line for a very long time, and I think I'm finally too tired to keep doing it." I finally found the strength to turn around. The movement was slow, agonizingly deliberate, a pivot on a fixed axis. because he refused to yield an inch. Turning meant I was now standing face to face with him. Our bodies separated by nothing but a few layers of wet clothing and a terrifying, naked honesty. I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. They were dark, searching, and filled with a raw, desperate vulnerability that stole the very air from my lungs. "Did I make you uncomfortable?" he asked softly, his eyes scanning every inch of my face for a reason to retreat, searching for any sign that he had finally gone too far. "No," I said, my voice regaining its steady edge even as my pulse raced at a gallop. "Not at all." He let out a long, shaky exhale, his gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second. A silent admission in itself, before locking back onto mine with a fierce, renewed focus. "I wasn't sure if you'd pull away," he confessed, his hand finally closing the distance and covering mine on the counter. His palm was burning hot, his grip firm and possessive, anchoring me to him in the middle of the storm. "You didn't give me a reason to," I countered, my heart swelling with a sudden, reckless courage that defied the rain and the rules we had lived by. He let out a short, breathless laugh, the sound vibrating in the narrow, heated space between our chests. "If I'm too close, you have to tell me now," he warned, his voice thick with a promise he couldn't take back. "Because I don't think I have it in me to stop myself from getting closer." I shook my head, my gaze locked on his, refusing to look away, refusing to let the moment pass. "You're not too close." The kettle began to whistle then. A shrill, piercing scream that should have shattered the moment, but it only served to heighten the frantic urgency between us. He didn't move to turn it off. He didn't care about the tea or the kitchen or the ticking clock. He just stood there, looking at me as if I were the only fixed point in a world that was spinning violently out of control. "I've wanted to do that for a long time," he whispered, his face dipping lower, his forehead almost coming to rest against mine. "Then why didn't you?" "Because I didn't know if you felt the spark," he said, his voice barely audible over the lashing rain. "I didn't know if you were waiting for me, too." I didn't answer with words. Couldn't find them anymore. Instead, I leaned forward, closing the final, agonizing bit of space between us. It wasn't a kiss yet, but it was a total surrender. It was the moment I stopped pretending that we were just two people sharing a kitchen on a rainy Tuesday. The rain continued to hammer against the glass, and the tea eventually grew stone cold in the mugs, the steam vanishing into the air. But neither of us noticed. The shift had happened, the spark had caught, and in the quiet, suffocating heat of that kitchen, the world as I had once known it simply ceased to exist.